Welcome to the Iron Direct Primary Care Show. I'm Stefan Hartmann, your host, and we have Professor and Dr. Rick Adante, FIT professor, whistleblower, recently on the James O'Keefe podcast after some news came out that FIT was still doing DEI or trying to subvert the new directorship that we should no longer be involved in DEI. We should not be funding it, and we need to be calling it out where we see it. And that's what you did. You lost your job because of it, for speaking the truth. Thanks for joining me here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of topics to discuss today. And I was just telling you how the way this practice has grown is from speaking the truth. And since day one, I've been speaking the truth, even though it got me censored on social media, got me fired from a couple jobs. Not just for, I actually was practicing the right way, ethically, trying to treat patients. That wasn't appreciated. So I had to, like you, I have about 4-5 different jobs just for doing the ethical thing.
We need leaders like that, and we need people with integrity.
It's costly, though. But I felt like every time something like that happened, it was a step in the right direction to where I am now.
Yeah, I've always experienced the same. The thing that I've always tried to extol and mention is something that dawned upon me in an interview at some point, or maybe just thinking about it on my own. The most costly part of that would be if you sacrificed your integrity.
Right.
It's more costly to continue the lie than to tell the truth. And that's including if you sacrifice your life for the truth, it's still more, it's a bigger price to continue the lie, because the bigger price is on your soul, and your soul will last longer than your life. And you will have to account for that after your life. And if you were to unpack that and think about it, that there is a price to silence. We do pay a price for telling the truth. We do pay a price for speaking up. Sometimes that price is very expensive, and it can be financially, reputationally, stress, pressure, duress. I'm sure you felt all of those things.
My wife says I don't. Yeah, it might be. I've been analyzed by other doctors as an ENTP, as a mesomorph. There's something about that where you have to have some sort of stress resilience. What, are you an ENTP?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure I've taken all those tests.
As a neuroscientist, you probably assessed this on yourself a couple of times.
Basically box it out. I've done all the psychological testing at NASA. I went through the astronaut selection process, the NASA mission process for the human exploration research analog that I did. I've done a lot of these exams. They drive me bonkers. And first of all, they're just annoying and long. Secondly, I'm always taking them from the vantage point of being a psychologist myself. I don't have a lot of confidence in these tests to begin with, because I understand that a lot of times they lack construct validity. There's a big push in the field to update our ethics and integrity of the actual research away from the reproducibility crisis in psychology. And part of that has led to a re-examination of what we call construct validity of our measures. And so when we've done that, the new generation of science and psychology has hovered over this notion that a lot of the tests we're using may not be actually measuring what we think they're measuring or what we want them to be measuring. And so when I take those tests, it's hard not to have the scientific curmudgeon mind. And when it's long hours of testing, you get frustrated. So I don't put a lot of stock in those things. I'm happy to go down that rabbit hole and talk more about the details of why some of it's a little bit dorky and nerdy. But if I've taken those tests, I've forgotten what they said because I take it with a grain of salt. I think that we're more than, as humans, we are more than what a simple test of binary answers can tell you about you or tell you about somebody else.
Yeah, so I'm very stress resilient. I'm not sure what it's from. It might be a neurotransmitter issue. It could be my tennis background. I trained in competitive tennis. And when you're out there on the tennis court, you're playing against yourself more than your opponent. It takes a lot of mental toughness to play junior tennis and professional tennis circuits where you're really just trying to not beat yourself the whole time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I assume that you may have felt those things, but not that it necessarily affected you. You clearly chose above the influences of stress and pressure because you didn't cave to them. You kept your integrity and you made the decisions you made to continue onwards, like a tennis champion would do. You feel the pressures in the match. If you don't, you'd be a little worried. You probably wouldn't have a good enough adrenaline spike to rise to the moment. You do want your competitors to feel it. You just want them to not be governed by it and to give into it, is how I've always looked at it. And it's funny, I was thinking about this morning as well, what you said. And I think that there's something to it, which is the notion that if you're a high-level tennis player, for instance, in respect to this conversation of integrity, courage, truth, how do people summon that and then draw upon it to do those right things? This has been the subject of a lot of conversations people ask me about lately. And I think that, first of all, those experiences that you had are good training opportunities. That you were trained in slow, low risk situations, right? So you lose a tennis match. Okay. Like you're okay, but you learn to not be scared of someone hitting the ball at 100 miles an hour at you. You learn to build that up as a kid or as a young man and as a grown man. And so you build these little, you can think of them as like calluses on your knees and elbows when you scrape and fall, learning how to walk. You're also doing that emotionally and mentally for your resilience, courage building, as you might think of it. And so I think that there's a subset of people, certainly young men, who you could pitch them with an extremely long list of daunting, terrible prices and costs to having to do something. And I see a smirk on your face. I think you know where I'm going. And I don't think it's going to be true for most people or most young men, but I think there's a subset of them who you tell them that and they're like, yeah, okay, so that's all I got to pay? I can do that. As a SEAL, CIA contractor, I think that if you were to tell somebody that they would have to undergo what a lot of people would consider torture, SEAL training, they actually have what's called water torture, drown proofing, and you have to go through all these awful things, run miles and miles a day on no sleep, and also have your shins broken with shin splints, run with broken legs continually with no sleep, and then go through what they call SEER training, which is basically get locked in a box in a coffin and then get taken out periodically to have the shit kicked out of you. Most people would be like, dear God, no, I don't want a piece of that. But if you can get through that, then you get to do some pretty fun adventures and hang out with some pretty fun people and play with some really fun toys. So you have that internal resiliency, that internal store of whatever that thing is, right? Grit, energy. But like those young men know that they have a bank account essentially that is wealthy enough of pain tolerance or wealthy enough of suffering capability that when you give them that big bill and say, this is what you're going to have to pay, all these things that people consider torture and suffering, to them, they're like, okay, yeah, let's do it.
It could be that they hear it on paper. Oh, yeah, it's bad. They don't know how bad it is, but the people who do get through it, those are the elite. That's that mental toughness elite.
Yeah, and that's what it sounded like to me when you were relating those experiences, when you gain that training in tennis, right, and your coaching and your experience. And then you can take that to your real life application professionally of facing struggle, threats to your integrity, the truth, courage, and you can draw upon those things without even having known where you're drawing it from.
Definitely my PA program training prepared me for COVID. Not the way they intended though, because it was grueling. Not the way PA school typically grueling for people where, yeah, it's like trying to drink water from a fire hose. The challenging part came in the clinical year, but not because it was difficult to apply it, but it's because I was in Massachusetts. I was in lefty Looneyville, and it was the middle of the Trump campaign to get elected. And everyone there was a leftist, and they assumed I was too, because I got into that program. And I got into that program because I tricked them that I was a leftist. Like literally during the interview, it was one-on-one with this lady, and it was my second time applying. I'd failed the first time getting into these places. I applied to 4 places, didn't get in. And it was my second interview. You have to apply, to go fly out, you have to stay at a hotel, you have to go in. And so I'm like, all right, got to get into this program. So I'm going to pretend to be a leftist. And that's exactly what I did. I spoke the blue policies, bleeding heart liberal. They accepted me.
Somehow you knew that you had to engage in that pretension.
I knew I had to. The didactic year was every professor who gave us a lecture had a negative spin on Trump. We're there trying to learn medicine. And they, every time, we're like, all right, here it comes. Boom, they hit us with one again and again. And then we even got a PowerPoint presentation on white male privilege, like 1 hour lecture. We had the professors up there crying about white male privilege. I'm just sitting there looking at some of my white male classmates like, what, is this real? Is this happening? Or is this like an onion piece that's happening in real life? This actually happened. I guess because there was a white man there and he sent a meme to one of the students who was an Indian girl. Then it got taken out of context and then we all had to sit through that. And that's the kind of indoctrination we had to go through. Like, I tried to blank out that lecture. I'm not sure what it was on, but we had a full tranny talk to us about trannies and medicine and stuff.
It's interesting that you mentioned those things. First, I was going to say it's unfortunate. You shouldn't have been, no students should be subjected to that even during the admissions process. You should never be receiving signals somehow from any industry or organization that you have to do your own counter signaling to let them know that you are in political accord. That's a shame. And speaking as a professor, I've been on admissions committees and boards, and I never wanted to convey that to like anybody. That's not right. But then it really shouldn't be coming in that respect from the classroom at that level. And I have a friend of mine, Joe Duarte. You should have him on. He is actually be a great guest. He got his PhD in, I think, social psychology. And he has an amazing story. He published a barn burner paper in 2015, I think, in Brain and Behavioral Sciences that set the field on fire in psychology. That basically was a massively long paper of a treatise about how political bias in social psychology has destroyed the field and made it meaningless. And we can't even find validity, that idea that we talked about a moment ago, construct validity, in the tests and measures used by the industry to report findings of their studies, that he's saying this means garbage. And he's a brilliant intellect, a great man of courage. And when he was interviewing for graduate schools back in the early 2000s, the story that he's recounted several times over is that he was denied admission because of his political beliefs, because somebody read his blog that he complained about Jimmy Carter or something. And they literally raked him over the coals on it and denied him admission based upon that. And so he's really led the fight as a great champion in that respect against political bias and indoctrination in the sciences and psychology, similar to what you described of your own interview process. The second thing I was going to say is that this has come up recently in a talk I gave to a bunch of generals and admirals about DEI and the military. And the premise that I was letting them know is that they've been duped into thinking that DEI is dead at Department of War, because in fact it's a Trojan horse that is still very much alive and indoctrinating soldiers and Department of War personnel being laundered through academia. And the message that I told them that they've heard that before, but it was exactly what you were relating, which is that when you were a student, all your professors were that way. And this message would not have resonated if not delivered in the immediate wake after what we all watched happen after the political assassination of Charlie Kirk, which was that all these people went online and celebrated, laughed, trampled on a grave, and said, he wasn't enough. We want his wife. We want his kids. We want all of you guys to suffer the same fate, effectively. That's not hyperbole from me. That's things that are documented, well documented online. They said those things. And so we know that, how they think. What they don't understand is that 90% of the people graduating doctoral training programs in psychology, and certainly those training those in doctoral training programs, also think the same thing. We know that from some of the data, even from that Joe Duarte published and other social psychologists who've actually sampled what are the ideological viewpoints of psychologists and of the students. The field is, not surprisingly, 90 to 99% left-leaning. So what does that mean? It means that next time your soldier is really in the throes of suicidal ideation and needs some psychological help, maybe Kabul just fell, as it did a few years ago under the Biden regime, and they are struggling because they are remembering the loss of their friend's life in setting up Kabul to be a safer place and fighting in Afghanistan. And now they feel like that is gone. So now they're wrestling with their own suicidal ideation, anger. They're seeking psychological care or PTSD. They're going to a clinician who is, statistically speaking, ideologically of the same exact mind frame as those who we watched what they said about Charlie Kirk and the rest of the country. So those people treating those soldiers, their families, and everybody else are thinking that about them. Is that really someone as an industry that we want treating our people in most need of it? Nobody thought about that. They think about DEI indoctrinating the military in other respects, but I'm like, do you understand that when your people and any of us go to get psychological help, let's say about maybe they're torn up about the assassination of Charlie Kirk right now in present moment, and they feel torn up, maybe it's reactivated some PTSD of seeing their other friends shot like that. You're going to go to somebody who's 90% statistically likely to feel that it was justified and proper and that you're wrong for mourning him. What does that mean to force readiness?
They have no one to go to.
Exactly. And so that is a deeply seated force readiness issue for the success of our forces, but also our nation. We can't continue to serve the nation, but we also can't continue to exist in a situation where that is the lopsided nature of how we're training people, how we are recruiting people, by the way. Sometimes like that training isn't always overt. That training can just be absorbed through 4 or 5 years in doctoral training because you see that's what other people think and you don't hear any other ways of thinking. And because you have a selection bias because they've selected people to do exactly what you did. Understand what the situation is and either be that situation or pretend to be that situation.
This is also an enormous business opportunity for a right-leaning psychologist like you. That's why I've been so successful. It's because I've been right-leaning, speaking the truth, and that's branded me as someone that people can come and trust and speak to about what's going on, what's on their mind openly without worrying about how I lean. Because a lot of medical professions very left-leaning, especially if they were trained in Eastern Massachusetts, Northeast USA, very left-leaning.
Yeah, and it's the culture that you have to live and work in. I lived and worked in academia for 25 years up until a month or two ago. It permeates in its own respect. And it's a hard thing to get around because the other thing I've been telling people at a level of policy consideration of what's a pathway forward? How do we right the ship? How do we fix that balance? And what we've done for a while has been play whack-a-mole. We'll find the bad actor, and if we're lucky, we'll be able to get that person removed or fired or replaced. And what that means is that we're fighting a war of attrition we're guaranteed to lose. Absolutely guaranteed to lose. We cannot win that war of attrition one by one. It just won't ever happen. So there has to be a different way. And part of the reason that we will learn that or lose that war of attrition is a great example is here at Florida Tech. Just the other day, yesterday actually, I saw it was the city of Melbourne. They voted down a proposal to name a certain street, the Charlie Kirk Memorial Street. And one of the reasons I saw in the paper, I think Florida Voice paper reported on that there were citizens locally here who went and spoke and against it and said, why are we doing this? This guy has literally no connection here at all. And they don't know this, but that's false. Charlie Kirk covered my story about Florida Institute of Technology just a few months ago. He published it through Turning Point USA's Professor Watch and literally warned the students of Melbourne, Florida, of Florida Institute of Technology, warned them about the president, warned him about his ideological bias, warned him about his lies, warned them about his defrauding, literally put him in his face, John Nicolo, on the Professor Watch of Turning Point USA. A direct connection to the Melbourne community. I mentioned that because that story is an illustration of how whack-a-mole will fail. And I'll unpack that in a moment. And I elaborated the reasons for that in my Substack, a report on that. Not only was he caught lying to the face of Ron DeSantis, but then it was the cover-up that was worse than the crime. He lied to the entire campus, the entire community, and pretended that was not the case. I have the video, and I absolutely proved that he lied about the lie. It was the cover-up. But interestingly, and here comes the whack-a-mole. So let's say that they oblige that and fire him, which they won't, and we know that they won't because at the same time that he put out public statements, April 9th, April 10th, the chair of the board of trustees, a lady named Kristen Draggers, who is an engineering executive locally here at Lockheed Martin, she put out her own statement in accord with him, but separately from the board of trustees saying we back him effectively entirely, saying the same lies. So she lied. Now, this is an interesting scenario as an aside here because she actually was not a witness to those events that were reported of what he did in that meeting. She wasn't there. So how can she know what to attest to She can't. No. So she's either telling a lie of what people told her actually happened, or she was lied to by the president. Either way, those are fireable offenses actually for both of them. I know for a fact because I was the actual witness. I was a person there, first person account. And I also have, if you don't believe maybe I perceived it wrong, maybe I'm retelling it wrong, you don't have to believe me. I also have the video and the audio, and it's published. The problem is that Kristen Dreggers, the chair of the board of trustees, is still the chair of the board of trustees. And she already has backed him and said, no, we like this stuff. We're going to keep doing our values. You need to do one easy Google search. Is all that it takes to look up stories from 3 years ago in Florida Today, praising her as the diversity chief of Lockheed Martin, talking about how she thinks that diversity is the most important part of engineering. There may be some people who disagree with that if they're on a Boeing that's not going, if they're on a spaceship that's not coming back to Earth because it's the Boeing Starship that's stuck on the ISS. There's reasons to contend with her premise that diversity is the most important part of engineering. So she tells us her values. She already knows this. And when it was politically cool and supportive, she was very open about her beliefs because she didn't think she needed to be undercover. So now when she backs it, we actually know what the truth is. And so when they say we're going to comply, first of all, we've already proved they're lying, but we've also proven that they're not trustable because we know what they really want and what they really believe. And therefore we can't trust them to self-certify that they're complying. And so when we play whack-a-mole and you take out the bad actor from their position, you're just going to have similarly minded people like her putting the next president in place. Right. And or similarly minded people on the boards of trustees replacing her with a similarly minded person. This has literally just happened last week at Texas A&M University. So I don't know if you're familiar with that story, but Texas Senator or Texas Representative Brian Harrison has been all over Bannon's war room for the last couple of weeks because he has worked with students who came to him with audio of being indoctrinated in children's literature classes about trans ideology for kids and all sorts of things and that are allegedly not supposed to be taught in Texas. And he railed pretty hard about it. And the president at Texas A&M University was protected for a while. But they successfully just got him removed. And what happens is they put a new guy in place who's a huge DEI champion. And they also just had a letter put out yesterday or the day prior by another board of trustees member at Texas A&M University, basically full-throating DEI and trans ideology and all that, and basically telling people to shut up and get with the program and just get trained in this stuff. It's illustrative and demonstrative of this notion of the failure of whack-a-mole in a war of attrition because they've already got their backups in place. And so a different approach has to be adopted if you are to be successful. Those are good steps that have to be done, and I absolutely celebrate Brian Harrison. He's been an incredible champion. It's just literally whack-a-mole, and so other approaches have to be used.
Trump came into office and he installed RFK, great, but they've been very slow to remove the swamp that's still in charge of the CDC schedule and the vaccines, all this stuff. I feel like people want to be politically correct. They don't want to get rid of the wrong actors, but they all need to be fired. They need to be put in jail. They need to go away. How do we get the president of FIT out of there and install you? Like, how do we get rid of these people?
That's a great question.
Like actual action.
I have some ideas for answers. So here's what I mean by that. So for one thing, that the office of Ron DeSantis here in Florida, he issued a statement to James O'Keefe when that story first broke in April 9th, I think it was. And he confirmed O'Keefe's reporting. He said, yes, this meeting did occur. We did meet with this university, Florida Institute of Technology, and we did tell them not to be woke. We did tell them that they couldn't do this. But then they completely walked back any accountability. They said, but it's a private institution, and so we can't really control that, but we know that if they continue to do this, their students will receive a poor education. So that, to me, is extraordinary cuckoldry. Yeah. That is not true, by the way. It's also not true that there's nothing you could do in a public leadership way to hold a private university accountable because, and I know this for a fact because I was in the meeting with the president of Florida Tech, and I have it on video recording that's public and published. He says, I don't want to lose the state funding we receive ease grants from the states, also student scholarships, bright future scholarships. We receive funding from Casey DeSantis's organization for healthcare and cancer screenings and things like that. We received that $7 million grant that was the premise of the O'Keefe story, the Ascend grant, that was signed off on, by the way, by the Senate Majority Leader, Boyd, Republican, and sponsored by the House Majority Leader as well, and was lobbied by the former Speaker of the House, Chris Afuli, and met with Ron DeSantis. So all four of these people are involved in this. We'll find out how. As it turns out, we just filed a lawsuit 2 days ago with Anthony Sabatini, and they may find that there may be a lot to explore in depositions and discovery of some pretty high-level leadership of Florida as to what happened in these grants. Why did they get funded, and how are they not getting yanked? Now, this goes to the answer to your question. So there is state funding to private institutions. We need the political will to freeze it or end it. And it's not just state level, because in the video that I got of him talking about using your tax money, and by the way, once he got done, together with a room of co-conspiring professors, admitting to lying about complying with DEI, they said, we're going to lie to their face. Don't get caught. Absolute roaring laughter when he finds out we actually have classes called DEI 101.
At FIT?
They changed the name of it. They changed the course description so it can covertly continue to be indoctrinated, which he said I support on the video. It was actually a 600 level class for, as it happens, doctoral level psychology training.
Of course.
In IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology, which helps to build out those examinations and psychological measures and tests.
That's why I hate those tests.
So anyways, he's unpacking that and he says, I don't want to lose the state funding, but I really don't want to lose the federal funding, which was $69 million in federal funding of Title IV funds from the Department of Education. That's just per year. Now, nobody knows what Title IV funds are from the federal Department of Education, but you've used them. It's called federal financial aid.
Oh, really?
Student financial aid.
Of course, that's right.
And this is where I said it gets politically unpalatable if you think about it. Like a lot of us, if you've gone through any kind of white collar training in academia, we've at some point or another, we've at least applied for, if not received, federal financial aid. Now, usually it's not free money unless you get a Pell Grant or something. It's a loan and you pay it back. But that is under the control and discretion of the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon. And I'd like to see her summon some WWF and decide that that shit is over, as Secretary Hegseth said from the Department of Defense.
It's over.
And so I'm just telling what I was taught behind closed doors by the president of Florida Tech, who said he thinks he would lose that money if he's caught and we're caught doing this defrauding on DEI and lying to the government about complying with the rules they say we need to comply with in order to keep your public tax money. So if he's telling me that, he's worried he could lose state funding from the administration of Ron DeSantis. Okay, good. Let's do that. He's saying he could lose money from the Trump administration, federal Department of Education. So to answer your question, that's something that can be done is say, why? First of all, freeze the money. Freeze it until we're not playing whack-a-mole. So the president has to go. But guess what? The person who lied about the president supporting him, the chair of the board of trustees, Kristen Dreggers, who thinks DEI is the most important part of engineering and backed him on the lie and the cover-up of this, she needs to go. And we also need to see full discovery of anybody else on the board who supported that.
This is huge.
So that's one thing, right? We're talking about a freeze, okay? That's, to me, the gentle approach. Freeze all state and federal funding. You know that's going to be really unpopular with students who are caught in the crossfire as collateral damage. You've been a student. If they froze your federal funding in the middle of classes, you would be
go protest,
pitchforks and torches. But we need to have the right proper messaging on that, which would be, we're not taking away your funding. It's your leaders at your campus who've lost it for you.
Yes.
It was them who sacrificed you on the altar of DEI. It's them who gambled with you. You were the bait that they put out for the tiger, and they were willing to do that. And so we need to make sure that is done. But if you think about it, these are young voters too, and politicians are scared of angering the youth, right? But I think that the culture has changed a little bit. And I think with the right explanation of that you just have to be a good mom and dad, so to speak, as a leader and be like, this is actually why the punishment is happening. And it's because of these actions, not these other ones that you're led to believe.
I could think of so many private schools that think they're above the law.
Everyone.
Every one of them. Everyone in the Northeast that I know, so social justice warrior, DEI. Everyone I applied to didn't choose me. They chose other people over me. 3.9 GPA, great volunteer service, great work experience. They didn't let me in again and again. I saw DEI get accepted ahead of me. Every one of those schools, they need their funding frozen immediately and then fire the people who are in charge of that DEI selection process. Get them out.
And so I'd love to peel back this onion because I think you're hovering right over the target here. So I've had conversations with other colleagues and friends of mine about these kind of ideas, right? Which is that they think, in contrast, say, state funding. So, for instance, here in Florida, DeSantis has a lot more control, they think, over the state university system. And in some respects, he does, because there is like an organizational chart of that it is under the umbrella that he's like the pinnacle of authority of, right? But there's also a lot more bureaucracy and protection given to state workers and employees at the universities. A lot of other places have unions. I'm not sure that Florida has much of a union, but irrespective, it's actually really tough to work with instituting change in the state university system because they do get a lot of state funding too. However, what people neglect to think is they think that the private universities, you talked about private ones in the Northeast. I went to the College of New Jersey in the Northeast, a public liberal arts college, but I'm very well familiar with the Northeast private college scene. And they think falsely that the private universities are somehow immune or self-funding when the truth is they are broke as a joke. There is not, with maybe a few exceptions of the Harvard, Princeton, Yales, where they have enough wealthy donors who can independently sustain them to certain extents. Most private universities are absolutely more dependent on public funding than they don't have enough donors like Florida Tech. And so when you can use, and this is just not complicated, just politics of utilization of power as vested through democracy and voting. If you're somebody like Ron DeSantis, for instance, in this case in Florida, and we saw Harmeet Dillon do this with University of Virginia not too long ago, you just say, we no longer have confidence in this institution to be stewards of the state funds that we are looking and wanting to give you to do good work. Under this leadership, we can't give you any more funds. You freeze the funds, and you can do that to a private university. They will dance to that money faster than a public one will remove a bad actor, because the public one has layers of bureaucracy. A private one, they can just fire anybody anytime they want, so to speak, or at least take faster action because they're private. And they also need those resources even more for sustenance. And this is something that could be done at the state level, is using the power of the freezing of those funds to say, we want to see change. And guess what? You don't have to do it, but I don't have to give you any money. You are completely free to be private. And if you don't want to change a single personnel thing, that's fine. That's okay. But I have absolutely no confidence that you're going to follow the law and follow the rules and comply with the regulatory requirements of the policies.
How do we audit them to make sure it's happening? Because they can, again, just say, oh, we're doing it now.
That's a good question. Permit me to circle back to that in just a second. And I just want to put an end note on the prior thing, because I think we need to do that from the federal level too. The example I used was the state level.
Oh, federal.
But the freezing is one way to go. But the second part is that it's made me think more recently, why is the federal government in the business of loaning out money for students to go to school and get indoctrinated at all? My wife took private loans from a bank to get her undergrad. This is not an unusual scenario. And from the sounds of it, in other departments of the federal government, it looks like they're looking to really whittle back the federal government's role in mortgages, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. I think that it's a ripe time to reflect on, does the government need to be involved in funding people's private educations? I'm not opposed to them having some scholarships for some, here for great students, this and that. There's okay, fine. But like, we clearly know there's a bubble in academia, right? There's a student financial aid bubble. There's all sorts of college costs going through the roof, but that's because the money is free from the government, so to speak. Now the students, all of us, right? We've been run through the ringer paying it back with student loans. And there's a lot to say and unpack about that on probably another conversation. But that's one way to help right the ship is, why don't we just get out of the business of giving that money? Because they're clearly doing what you were alluding to in your next question, which is lying about complying. And how do you? I think there are some ways that we can go about that I'm happy to elaborate in a minute on. But if you can't have confidence that they're actually complying by telling you the truth that they're complying, why are we in the business of giving them money? I'm not saying they can't get loans to go to college. I am very confident that there's a lot of banks out there that would be more than happy to give them funding to go to college. They can still go to college, but maybe we're at the point where that's a healthy conversation to have as a nation, as a community, about, is that the role, or is it a role that has been abused to the extent that it might be worth reconsidering and not continuing on? And if you do that, that's the same thing on the military side. So you have Department of Defense. That was part of the other message that I was working with the people from the Pentagon on, is why are we using Department of War funds to send to institutions who admit, like Florida Tech behind closed doors on video, that they think that critical race theory is valuable history to teach people, who they think that veterans' preference is the same thing as DEI and diversity, which of course it's not. Veterans earn their preference through sacrifice, service. DEI is, of course, just given to you based upon the genes of melanin that you inherited by virtue of being born. No different than a preference given to you by virtue of being born the heir to the Rockefeller fortune or something. Like, either way, it's discriminatory and wrong. And why are we using DoD funds to pay for schools who are lying about complying and are actively working to subvert those compliances to indoctrinate students? And if the students include DoD personnel, you are training through critical race theory, which teaches anti-American hate, to hate your country. And then we're going to launder that person back into a leadership position into the military. And how are they to fight and be ready to die, or lead others to fight and die for a country that they are taught to hate? And that is a risk to national security. That is a risk to force readiness. And that should be in grounds to do the same freezing of funds. So what kind of funds? ROTC takes military funds at almost every school in the country. What other kind of funds? Well, you also have DARPA funds for research at a lot of major research institutions. The GI Bill, that's actually administered through the VA. So you do have the ability to say, this is not where we want to send our funds. It's not where we want to send our people to get indoctrinated by people we can't trust to tell the truth. You can't trust them. So that's the big issue. One of the things you asked about, how do we do that? Right now, we are relying upon self-certification. You check a box and say, we're not doing this. And you hope that they are telling the truth, but you can only catch that if there was a later thing to come up that then you could hold them accountable for essentially fraud by saying, you did check this box a couple of years ago, said that you weren't going to do this. It turns out you did. So right off the bat, your filter has become so thin that you allow almost anybody to get through by lying. Now, part of that's a manpower issue, enforcement, but there are ways around that too. So for instance, using the power of the purse, the freezing of funds, or just the ending of funds, right? You can leverage the replacement of personnel. For instance, we don't have enough people in the country who are probably qualified to replace all the deans, provosts, and presidents in the country, because you do have certain qualifications required for that, PhDs and all the things that have essentially led to this lopsided ideological imbalance. But there's no such credentialing requirements for anybody on boards of directors, boards of trustees. Replace them with citizens.
There you go.
Replace them with If you declare a national emergency, which we have effectively just seen through the declaration of Antifa as a national terrorist cell, which, by the way, that almost defines every university as a terror cell because they provide material support to student Antifa groups and professors who are advisors for those student groups or sympathizers. You could potentially justify, you can have people from the DoD sit on the boards, and they're under obligations to follow orders, whether they like them or not. And then you could still, they will have more hiring and firing authorities for the leadership of institutions. So you backstop that whack-a-mole issue. But you need to have the courage organizationally to hold the line on that while people cry a little bit. I have a toddler at home. He cried all night because he wanted warm milk before bed, but he misbehaved during the day. So it was really tough. I really wanted to cave because he was crying through midnight. I just wanted to sleep, but somebody has to be dad.
Man, that would be amazing. I'd love to see that happen. Get rid of them, replace it with patriotic citizens. I'll sit on the board of directors up there at FIT. I'll tell them what's what. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, when we say take our country back, it means I don't want somebody else to do it for us. It means the citizens have to be willing to serve, and that's part of the issue, right? These are not oftentimes paid positions, and even if they are, they're poorly paid. A lot of good people don't want to do it because it is an actual sacrifice of service. The left has done this for a really long time, very well, for decades and decades. People on the right went to business to make more money. You gave away the ship because you didn't want to stand your post and serve. Now, I've been doing this for 25 years, making no money. We need more people to serve. Like you said, sit on it. So when we talk about Moms for Liberty has done a great job of this at the K through 12 level of school boards, which is a start, and we need to continue that and do more of it. But nobody's thinking about that at the university level. You don't need to have a PhD to sit on a university board. And there are ways that could be looked at. And maybe you don't do all this stuff, right? Maybe the things I'm suggesting, maybe they open the door to some other creative idea or an approach that may. And that's essentially the scientific process, right? So you fail. Okay, but you learn some stuff and figuring out what didn't work about that. So maybe we find out a better way by more thought and more development and trying things out. But I think we're at a point of critical mass where those creative ideas need to be implemented and tried. And we have to be, there's a saying in Silicon Valley, move fast to break things.
Yes. I think that's the way forward. If we can change the academic, the Moms for Liberty starting at the K through 12, the university level is where those K through 12 get indoctrinated further. So if we can get there and get the right people on directing the university in the right direction, then we won't have Antifa coming out of universities. We don't have a brainwashed generation again.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear too, like an academic level of training and ideology and free speech. I'm not saying to do anything that would be a violation of anybody's constitutional rights. And I don't want censorship through the universities. I want there to be a free exploration of thought and speech, especially controversial speech, especially offensive things. I don't want there to be that kind of thing. So I don't want to be misunderstood or misinterpreted in that respect. What I'm referring to is that I don't think it's unreasonable to say that certain speech is incitement to violence. There are limits to free speech that are not defined by me. They've been defined by the Supreme Court and the other lower levels of the courts that have defined some things that you're not allowed to say. And I think what I'm referring to here is the notion of, say, Department of War freezing or withholding funds. I don't think it's unreasonable for the Department of War to say, we will give no longer 1 cent to any institution in this United States if they're going to teach untrue things. What do we mean by that? Critical race theory. They teach factually untrue elements of American history. This is not an issue of academic freedom. This is not an issue of freedom of thought. This is not an issue of offensive speech or anything like that. I actually encourage all of those things. And there's nothing wrong with teaching things that might be aligned with a liberal point of view. But here's the thing. It has to be factual. We cannot use federal funds to teach untrue things. There are two genders. Yeah. There are two genders. If you are teaching otherwise as an institution, no funds. Use a Seinfeld meme. No soup for you. At what point are we going to get real? And are we going to get tough? And are we going to get serious? Because I think that's a pathway strategically that is fair, proper, legal, and constitutional. You can't indoctrinate our warriors to hate America with false things, with untrue things about American history, with untrue things about biology, medicine, psychology, gender dysphoria. If you will teach untrue things, I think it's reasonable to say that's not speech, that you are free to receive our funding for speaking. And we're willing to pull that funding because, like, you have to, we'll pay for you to teach true things, but we will pay you to teach false things to our children, to our soldiers, our airmen, our sailors, our leaders. That's pinnacle stupidity.
And evil.
It is evil. So I'm speaking right on the academic side. Let's just apply the same thing. And I say this because it's going to show how hard this is and why it won't happen. I mentioned Kristen Dreggers, the chair of the board of trustees at Florida Tech, who absolutely lied publicly in covering up the scandal at Florida Tech from the president, John Niccolo, that James O'Keefe revealed by backing it entirely. And I mentioned that she is also an executive at Lockheed Martin here, which has a big hub here in Melbourne, Florida, and the Space Coast. And that she was a big champion of diversity being the most important part of engineering at Lockheed, et cetera, et cetera. Who takes a ton of aerospace and defense money? Aerospace and defense firms, Lockheed, Boeing, L3 Harris, Leonard DRS, Raytheon, all the corporation. You know who probably gets a ton of DoD money? Probably Coca-Cola, General Electric, all the people that feed the DoD. Yeah. I bet they have a Coke machine at every base.
Sure.
So they make eggs and bacon in the mess hall. And like, when we decide we actually mean what we say and that we are serious about this, funding for all of those things will dry up to every one of those private businesses and corporations in aerospace and the military industrial defense complex, drone companies. Every single company, if they're not willing to drop that anti-American hate that celebrates the death of Charlie Kirk by indoctrinating these ideas of diversity that he fought so vigorously to end, because it's not diversity of thought that they're advancing, like you said, it's diversity of melanin, which is absurd because it doesn't make any team better. This comes from IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology. They're the ones that do all these psychometric measures, and they have a big claim. That's where the claim that diversity is our strength comes from, because they comes from studies. Actually, there's a McKinsey study that claimed that quote unquote diverse teams performed better. That has not been replicable. That was a 2015 study that has been widely questioned and panned because it's not actually replicable. But this idea of diversity, they looked at diversity in terms of skin color of teams. You could have a team that is non-diverse at all in their thoughts. They all believe the same things in completely different skin tones and colors. Think about the null hypothesis here scientifically. You're saying that the colors of people on a team who all think and believe the same things, that team is going to do better based on skin color. That's one, extraordinarily racist, not completely disavow, but isn't what makes teams better and people perform better? First of all, like, sure, different vantage points, but it's the things that makes them strong are the things that they share together, their shared values, their sameness, because that's what you rely upon when everybody will have a difference of opinion or view or dispute. These things happen. It's not that unusual. We're humans. Families have a tough time deciding what to order for dinner at the restaurant. These are not unusual situations, but it's our sameness, the things we've shared together that give us our strength to succeed in the deepest, darkest, most difficult of times. And like that notion, we're going to stop buying airplanes and fighter jets, then we're going to keep having it.
So the whole DEI makes a team better. That came from your industry, that specific industrial psychology.
Not me.
I know my dad, he works in engineering at Siemens, and Siemens recently sent out a memo how we have to comply with the new mandate, but we're still going to support whatever people's different viewpoints. They worded it some way so they couldn't get called out and lose their funding, but they're still hiring DEI. I mean, they're still doing the same.
They're doing exactly what I caught in the back room. And this is what's valuable about the story that James broke at Florida Tech and that Charlie Kirk covered, which is that they all do what you just said. That happened to your dad at Siemens everywhere. They issued a statement saying, we're going to comply, but we're still going to maintain our values. I found out from the inside telling that what does it mean by they say our values? They say the same thing that we're not supposed to do. They said, we want to fly under the radar, keep teaching this. These are valuable classes. We just don't want to we don't want to write it down because we don't want it to be used as evidence against us in court. They wrote that and sent it to us.
Right.
And then he came and he spoke it. Like, this is what's happening. And this is why I'm speaking out to the world and doing these shows, because people need to understand in places of compliance and government, you are being lied to, and they're lying to your face while they're laughing behind your back. They are lying to you. They are not complying, and they are laughing about it behind your back. And this is not the only place it's happening. This is not a one-off. And this is, by the way, all these other stories that are coming out in the news, it's generally a mid-level or low-level staffer or a dean or somebody in the middle who they can throw under the bus and say, that's not our actual institutional position. Like your father's company at Siemens would have said, no, your dad doesn't speak for them. And da-da-da. That is one of the reasons this story is valuable, is because it says this is not a low-level staffer. This is the president of the university speaking on behalf of the university's position and explaining how he's engaging in the deception and what it actually, that's not happening anywhere else except for maybe a little bit of what Brian Harrison caught at Texas A&M University that's been popularized by Steve Bannon on the Worm. So this is not a one-off at Florida Tech. How do I know that? Because I've got other presidents on tape saying the same stuff. It hasn't come out yet. Actually, it did a little bit, but not really. I have a president at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills, who talked about on video that he gave a big talk to that was being recorded and was told that we could distribute.
All right.
And he's, yeah, everybody knows the Trump administration hates black people, hates brown people, hates immigrants. We need to fight against them. All the same stuff.
Wow.
Wildly racist stuff coming from an institutional president.
He's still in power? He's still there?
He's still there. Now, before he even said that, he's already announced his retirement for it, so he's a lame duck. But like, that guy said that, and they have an ROTC unit. So that guy's, and he's also a clinical psychologist. So we talk about, so you want somebody like that, and he talked about that he believes that residual white supremacy is guiding the Trump administration. He thinks that residual white supremacy is basically driving people and things. Whether you think you have it or not, he knows you do. So it's a unfalsifiable hypothesis. And that's a person who's guiding an institution who teaches clinical psychology, teaches people who might end up counseling veterans, who might end up counseling people undergoing grief by watching Charlie Kirk get shot in the neck and have all of his blood come out in front of his children. This is an ideology that has long tentacles of implications. And they have an RTC unit. I'm sure they take GI Bill funds. There's layers to that. And again, it's used as an illustration here that what we reported at Florida Tech is not a one-off. It is happening everywhere, in every institution, just like you related of your dad's experience. And I promise it's just going to keep happening unless we get tough in the ways that really, truly will turn the spigot off.
One other huge topic I want to talk to you about is how our professions, but in particular the psychology profession, has been weaponized to create this gender dysphoria, this tranny movement. Like your profession in particular has been spearheaded to convert young individuals into thinking they're not who they are. And then, of course, falling into this LGBT, which is obviously left, it's Democrat voting. So break that down for me.
There's a lot to unpack there. One, the whole topic makes me very sad because there are so many victims of the field. These young children and adults, by the way, who are deceived into thinking that they're not the gender that they are, that they're not the sex that they are. It's a criminal travesty. And I have to keep myself in check at times because it's impossible not to make a person angry. And I have to first I just pray for those people who've been preyed upon, because it makes me sad for them, because it is a criminal travesty. That field has been absolutely weaponized.
It has.
This has been going on for a long time throughout culture and society, certainly going back to the 40s, 50s, 60s. There's documents that I've heard about. The Communist Party targeted their initiatives to operate through the field of psychology to influence culture and society. Maybe we see part of that manifesting here as well. There's something deep and dark about anything like that targets kids. First through the psychology, and then through the medical side,
yes,
of the surgeries or the chemicals.
It starts when the vulnerable patient goes to the mental health and the mental health provider confirms, yes, you have this diagnosis. You're living in the wrong body. It starts there. Like confirmation bias.
And I would wager that it even starts beyond that too, in other nefarious ways. So that same industry was also working parents. And this sounds so bonkers, but you see it when you see these parents who go on social media and talk about how their 2-year-old thinks they're the other gender, or the parents are taught to cultivate the kids in that way.
That's true.
So it's not just waiting for the kid to show up at your office and then affirming what they...
Keepers of that. We're supposed to tell our patients, no, you don't need an antibiotic for your sore throat that you had for 12 hours today. No, you don't need that. We're supposed to be the gatekeepers of that.
Yeah, we're supposed to have integrity, and we're supposed to tell the truth. And it's not the truth that you can have a different gender. It's not the truth that you can have a different sex or that you can change it. That's not the truth. And that's a really big problem. I've seen it taught by other people. I've had to correct it in classes. I've seen professors at Florida Tech teach that in their class of psychology, sexuality, and those kind of things. Like they literally teach false information. And this is another target, by the way, to fix it. Address it through accreditation boards. Accreditation needs to put the stop to that too. You can't be teaching false, untrue things. And if we find out that you are, and we can review that at any given time through a syllabi review or course material review, you can put some pretty serious teeth in there if you got the stones for it. So I've seen it. I've seen people teach it at Florida Tech. I've seen it literally harbored and built and developed, teaching it into their students. And not just there. I was in clinical psychology programs as well at Cal State San Bernardino. It's really pretty nefarious. And I'll give you one example of one thing that at least I tried to do to stop it. Last year, I was asked to review a textbook from a friend of mine and a colleague who I still hope is a friend. And even though we're not necessarily colleagues anymore, but they wrote a textbook that was otherwise reasonably good. And I got asked to write a review and publish it for a journal. So I did, and I recruited some students to do it, to help them get some experience, get them some training, and also help build their professional development and get them some authorship on peer-reviewed publications and things like that. The very last chapter has a section on gender dysphoria and this whole trans ideology thing. And it's like a clinical neuroscience book, and it created this kind of like ethical dilemma for us, because the truth is the truth. And we have to speak the truth. And what was being said in that section of the book was not true. It wasn't based in research. In fact, they didn't even cite any research at all. It was just declared via fiat. They just declared it. This is what it is. They didn't cite anything, which is pretty important to do, but especially important to do on controversial things. And the levels of a sort of an ethical dilemma that we wrestled with were like multiple. So one level was just the truth. You want to speak the truth. Two, it's like there's social political things. This is a friend of mine, a colleague. And three, it's controversial. Nobody really wants to like jump on grenades and invite incoming if you can avoid it. So there's a natural human desire to protect. But really the bigger thing that I was concerned about was my students, co-authors. I'm a tenure professor. I'll be okay. You want to come at me? I'm not too worried. But you do have this fatherly desire to shepherd your students and make sure that they can avoid anything that would accelerate their career. And we had to wrestle with what's a pathway forward on this. And the first thing we did, I talked to the students. And when I recruited them, it's the first thing I said. I said, hey, I'd like to recruit you to help be a co-author. This is a great opportunity for you. But this is my vision of how I'd like the whole project to look. And this is what I'm thinking about doing. And this is how I'm looking to approach it. Certainly would value your input. But there is this last section that we're going to have to wrestle with. And I said, kind of like what I just said, I said, here's the pros, here's the cons, this is what I'm. And I understand if you don't want to do it. I understand if it might be something you even disagree with or whatever. But I think that there's a way that we can do this in a diplomatic way that also preserves the truth. But it's okay if you don't want to do it. You don't have to be involved. And we approached it in a diplomatic way. And we basically just said, when we published it, it's out there saying that like the book didn't cite anything to support their premises. And here's a bunch of citations that we can offer of reasons to think that the existing research in that industry of this gender dysphoria and trans mutilation in kids is wrong. It's false and not good science, not based on construct validity that we started our conversation talking about, and is faulty, has confounds. And so we tried to teach the academic and scientific approach to making a persuasive case on evidence, citation, support, and do it in a diplomatic way that we could have dodged. We could have just said, we're not going to say anything. We have plenty else to write. But like really the ethical part that grabbed us and that I could not shake. And you can verify this, ask my wife, like she'll tell you, I couldn't shake it ethically, which is just the fact that like maybe a parent is going through something awful like this with a kid and they're looking for something and someone is going to show them this textbook and say, look, it's in the textbook. This is a real thing. What are you going to do? As a parent, if you don't know, they're looking to us as leaders, ethical leaders. Like you said, as a clinician, you're supposed to not give antibiotics if it's not needing antibiotics. And I couldn't shake it. I couldn't shake it ethically. I said, that parent needs to have a resource that they can point to as well that shows them the actual truth. So they're not emotionally blackmailed into cutting off the genitals of their children or chemically castrating them. This is an atrocity at the level of, it should be treated like the Nuremberg trials.
Yes.
That's
I'd love to see.
how we approached it was, let's give a tool to show what the research was that other people have advocated. So we cited the Cass report and a lot of other things and made our case that we hope is professional and diplomatic. And then I've talked with my colleagues and they said, yeah, that you made a good point. And not a lot of people would have done that in the industry. They're not willing to always challenge that. And the price to pay is our children. And I was talking, do you know who Ethan Haim is?
No.
He is an absolutely courageous clinician who blew the whistle on the trans surgeries at Texas Children's Hospital. You may know about the story.
I know the best story.
That's Ethan. He's the guy that Biden's Department of Justice raided illegally with lies that later came out in the court proceedings that they had lies and lied on search warrants and other things like that in the case against him. Just raw intimidation and retaliation against him for revealing the truth of Nuremberg level atrocities that were happening to children surgically at Texas Children's Hospital. So I was having this conversation with Ethan not too long ago at some point, which is that if you think about it, this is no different than like what society has wrestled with in other domains, like frontal lobotomies.
Oh, yeah.
There is a great book, if you haven't read it, it's like The History of Patient or something like that is the name of it. Luke Dietrich wrote the book, and it's about the most famous brain damaged patient in the world. Patient had a bilateral medial temporal lobectomy, had dense amnesia thereafter, and became the most studied patient in human history. Luke, his grandfather was the surgeon who did the surgery, so he had a lot of personal family connections to that story, and he wrote a big expose in 2016 that came out about a lot of scandal that ended up never being known for decades about that case. But in his book, and at that point they're talking about psychosurgery, frontal lobotomies, what have you, he relates a story from, I want to say the 70s, which was congressional testimony to the Senate committee that was led by Ted Kennedy at the time, who had a sister, Rosemary Kennedy. And the doctor testifying to the U.S. Senate was Dr. Peter Breggin, who has some great books out there too. He was a Harvard psychiatrist, and he made a great appeal to the United States Senate about the dangers of frontal lobotomy and saying that if we fall to communism or tyranny in this country, it won't be at the butt of a rifle. It'll be at the pen of the writings of psychologists and psychiatrists. And he said they're diagnosing and doing these procedures like frontal lobotomies, neurosurgery, psychosurgery. And he said, and I signed this in class all the time. We always talked about it. And he made a great point that, like, just because a doctor says it's okay to chop this thing off of your body, it doesn't make it okay. No. So if a doctor said to chop off your arm and you didn't need to chop off your arm, that's illegal. That's exactly the point. So if, you're a clinician, you're allowed to do a lot of things. You can do injections. I don't know the permissions you have on surgical procedures, but like you can cut things, you can inject things, you can prescribe things. Excuse me.
You can't do a frontal lobotomy.
No, but like you do have boundaries of what you can't do. You still can't do illegal actions. And so if somebody comes to you, and this is a great kind of allegory for people to approach and understand this trans situation in culture, society, and medicine, which is that if you're a surgeon and somebody comes to you with an amputation fetish, and which is actually, it actually is a weird thing, right? It's out there. Like, you can't start chopping off their fingers, then their arm, then their shoulder, like just because they want it and it will make them feel psychologically healthy. And you as a professional may deem, in your best medical opinion, that is a necessary procedure. That won't stop you from going to jail, because you can't do that.
Right.
You can't just chop off body parts of your arm or your leg or your nose or earlobe because you want to. There has to be a medically justifiable reason, and a properly justifiable one in that respect. That would be criminal.
Right.
And it is. It literally is criminal. And so that, it's the same thing. If somebody wants to come to you and say, chop off the breast or the genitals, like that, you can't just do that because it's essentially a fetish.
Right.
And it's not legal. It's not medical. It's not scientifically justifiable. And it's such an understatement. I can't even say it to say that you are hurting the person who it's happening to, because it's so much deeper than that. Like, these are beautiful creatures of God who may be confused. They may be struggling. And there certainly is a lot of other things happening. People think Nuremberg trials, by the way, were about the atrocities that happened in concentration camps of like gas chambers. And they were. Those things were definitely on trial. But people forget that other things that were on trial was medical experimentation. Yeah. On people in concentration camps and other things where the Nazis, and also, by the way, the Japanese did this too. The Japanese did some really awful medical experiments comparable to, if not worse than the Nazis as well. But that's what a lot of the Nuremberg trials were actually about. And that's where we got things like the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki for ethics, of how do you actually conduct proper research with consent on the people being experimented upon. It was because of the experiments that were done in these camps medically. They did awful things like amputations against the will or tricking people to engage in these things. That's what's happening in these trans things. And until we start as a culture codifying that you will lose your license and never be able to practice medicine again ever in your life.
Go to jail.
Because you're in jail and you lose your license. Like, I don't understand why this is a difficult concept for people.
It's such a simple concept, but we don't have leaders with spines who can go out there and say, you're doing this right now. We're going to arrest you and we're putting you in jail. And we're going to go out and investigate the people who've been doing this and put them in jail for life. That's what needs to happen right now.
I was watching a clip. I think it was Charlie Kirk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Is that his last name?
Yes.
That was obviously an older clip from probably the election season or something like that. But they were talking about this matter. And I think that what Vivek said was wrong, but it has been the mainline approach. I understand why it has been the mainline approach, because it's a very effective political approach in strategy, which was, he said, look, you do what you want to do as an adult. I'm not going to get in the way of your life, of your sexual life or preferences or whatever, but you can't do this stuff to kids. And I think that's a message that clearly resonates, like an 80-20 issue, right? It really resonated with American culture. People are like, yeah, like it's pretty messed up to do this to kids. And most people have wide agreement. But I think the big problem, like you said, is people need to get tough politically and say no, because what the reason it's weak, and I remember talking about this when I saw this a few days ago, which is that I think that there's a better argument to be made. The proper one, the only one, is that it has nothing to do with being minors. It has everything to do with being a human being. And the same exact thing is true for adults. I don't care if you're over 18. You can't go to a doctor and ask him to chop off your elbow.
Right.
The minor thing is a whole level of awfulness.
Awful. Everyone agrees about that.
But if you really think at the end of the day, it's a moral reasoning that you don't do this to humans. The same thing Dr. Peter Breggin testified to in Ted Kennedy's Senate hearings in the 70s or what have you about frontal lobotomies, which is that same premise that you can't just chop off body parts because a doctor says so. We don't allow that as a culture and society, and we can't allow it as a culture and society. And that is an adult issue. Like, it's not uncool to not want adults to have their body parts chopped off.
If our federal government, if our FDA doesn't have the spine to do it, I think we can do it at a local level. We can go to our local town commissions. We can go to our Brevard local county commission, and we can tell them this needs to happen. We need to go out and we need to prosecute and arrest these psychologists, psychiatrists, surgeons, PAs, nurse practitioners who are actively doing this, who are mutilating people, castrating them, doing surgical procedures on them that are converting them to some weird, non-natural thing. This needs to go out and happen.
Yeah, something has to happen that can ensure that not just children are safe. Obviously, children are a priority of a culture and society. I really don't want to throw adults under the bus here. Like, adults matter. It's not just that children have to be safe. Like, our culture has to be safe from this.
Yes.
Like, vulnerable adults as well.
I agree. So maybe you can help me and start pushing our politicians in this direction. If we can start it locally, then it could potentially become more national.
Yeah. I don't, at a risk of sounding trite, like, I don't understand why it's that hard to write a bill that says you can't do this. Now, I think that's effectively what Tennessee has done and was just affirmed by the Supreme Court.
Good.
Enormous credit to Matt Walsh for his leadership on that. People don't know Matt's story. He started off working at Blockbuster Video and built a blog, and from a blog became a writer and a media personality. And then he built these wildly successful cinema movies that were addressing controversial topics of what is a woman, became a real famous movie, and what was the other one? Am I a Racist? He led the culture shift on that before it was cool. That was very unpopular to endeavor that. No, really. And he did it. And when he saw those surgeries happening in his own state at Vanderbilt University, he engaged in the political process of lobbying his local representatives in Tennessee to put a law in place to protect kids from that kind of absolute abomination. Yep. And that law was challenged. It was validated and upheld by the Supreme Court very recently. So that should be a lesson in civics right there for people because that's how you do it. You don't put a bullet in the throat of Charlie Kirk. You don't put a bullet in a bunch of kids in a church in Minnesota, which is what these trans people do instead. Matt did it the right way. He didn't do violence. He engaged the political process when it was unpopular. But like, therein lies the difference.
It will be unpopular to push this through. One, because both our professions validate this process of abominations. We need to be steadfast and no, it is an abomination. We shouldn't be doing that. We have a moral obligation as clinicians to stop it. And it's up to us to push our leaders in that direction because they're relying on maybe lefty psychiatrists, psychologists, clinicians who validate this mental illness. And they're like, we don't know. The evidence is bullshit.
There is no evidence.
There's no evidence for this. This is complete malpractice. We need to grow a spine and stop it.
Yeah, not to get too nerdy on like science stuff, but on the ethics or on the esoteric side of the philosophy of science, there can be evidence, but evidence can be good or evidence can be bad. Psychology is a great field for this to illustrate these points because you can think of a visual illusion or an auditory illusion. Those are evidence. You can be looking at something and all evidence points to a certain conclusion. But we don't know if that conclusion is true or not. That evidence is just, it can exist as evidence, but it doesn't mean that it's evidence of the truth. Think about it in a criminal sense too. So if you're like forensics, you could have evidence that somebody did the crime. They could have been there. Well, you got your cell phone ping data. You were there. That is evidence. But that's not evidence they did it. It's evidence they were there. So it's evidence, but it's not good evidence that they committed the actual crime, which is the truth that is being sought in the process. We actually want to know the truth about a particular thing, and some evidence may align with it, but it doesn't mean that it is. Auditory hallucinations and schizophrenia, visual illusions on Facebook, the red dress or the blue dress or the gold dress, however that is, right? Like those are, our perception is evidence, but not all evidence is correct. Not all evidence good. Some evidence is bad. Some evidence is tainted. DNA evidence could be tainted with another person's DNA. So people need to unpack that in a social cultural sense. It's not crime TV where it's a TV show and you just say, oh, there's evidence of this. So when people say, oh, there's this evidence from the literature or something like that, when you look again at the construct validity, how was that evidence collected? A lot of times you find that evidence is actually not very good. And I say that in the context of what you said, like doctors, clinicians, these agencies, they're endorsing these kind of surgeries or treatments because they think it's from the literature that provides them evidence, but they don't understand that the evidence itself is not actually very good evidence at all.
No, and they're all patting themselves on the back. Oh, you're so great. You get an award for this. You wrote this great paper. There's a great self-congratulatory in this 90% of psychologists thinking the same way. And of course, they're the majority. The majority agrees. This is the evidence. It doesn't matter. You're wrong.
And there's just so many examples in the world history of science and culture too, of the group being wrong. Yeah. Sometimes the group is right too, by the way. I remember sitting in a talk in this as a postdoc, and somebody was talking about some network analysis and brain activity or something, and they were using something that's now come more to the forefront of the AI and other things like that, where when people are doing certain algorithms, they talk about the wisdom of the crowd. And that's how you can crowdsource something or whatever. And so I remember asking this in the audience. It was like a seminar. I was at UT Dallas. And it was just an offhand comment that the presenter made. So the professor, he said, oh, we use this analysis called the wisdom of the crowd to do this and this. And I said, some crowds aren't that wise. I've seen a lot of crowds do some pretty unwise things. How can you even be sure that you've accounted for false positives and things like that through this procedure and analysis? Important to remember that majorities are not always right. And that's actually why science is valuable, because over time we can sift evidence for what is the good evidence, what is the bad evidence, and try to resolve what is actually true despite a crowd. Famous examples, heliophysics and all sorts of things.
Recently it was COVID, like every mandate, quarantine, mask, locking up the tennis courts in Melbourne Beach, sending the police to chase people off the beach for exercising. That was a majority agreement that was so wrong, and they were following CDC evidence. Idiots, a lot of them.
Yeah, and I hope that's a really good learning moment for a lot of people generationally, because you really don't get those opportunities generationally to have firsthand experience of seeing the power of government, the power of tyranny, but the power of large groups and social pressure, and again, the power of majority. And particularly the prospect that sometimes we have to consider the majority might be wrong, especially when we're in the majority. And in respect to the medical profession and things like that, I think one of the things that people found jarring was that we learned that clinicians don't actually know what we thought they knew and what they think they knew. And that's not a knock on clinicians. My sister's a clinician. My wife is a clinician. I've trained clinicians. I don't mean that in a pejorative way. You're a clinician. When you're a clinician, you're really busy usually. You're busy treating people. You have very little time, but very little training and, say, understanding the research literature. It's just a different industry. I'm a scientist. I'm not trained to treat people because I spend all my time having to figure out science. It's a different skill set. It's very delicate and nuanced. It takes a lot of time to understand and to read the literature, understand the literature, produce the literature, and to think critically. And the nature of clinicians do so many amazing things. They save lives. They help people in so many different ways. But you're so busy doing it that a lot of times what ends up happening pragmatically is, for generations, they trusted the education, continuing education, CE classes, and the guidance that they are given from their professional organizations, the American Medical Association, American Psychological Association, Psychiatric Association, all the American Academy of Pediatrics. Like you trusted the guidance you got from them and the guidance that they basically took from the FDA, the CDC, NIH, whatever it is, right? That is the source of your information. And every single step was embedded with trust, not science. Trust, faith. A lot of times it's
dogma and hierarchy.
And I have a friend of mine who's a plastic surgeon. A lot of people think that science isn't faith, but science is entirely contingent upon trust and faith, because I'm a journal editor, journal reviewer. I have never once seen anybody's raw data that we've published and approved because I trust them, and we have to trust them because it took them years to filter and organize that raw data. I'm not doing their homework for them. I'm not spending more years to check their homework. We absolutely are basing the industry of science on trust because of an archaic idea of honor.
Yes.
We are assuming that people have the honor to maintain their integrity of telling the truth and not submitting fraudulent stuff or performing shoddy analyses or procedures that cut corners that might give false findings.
No one knows that the data, the raw data, is never analyzed by the peer review.
And that's not meant to be, again, in like a pejorative way. It's a straight up pragmatic. It's just, I don't have time. Nobody has time. Like you can't. The bottleneck, you will never find a cure for cancer if you comb through everyone's original data.
We could use AI now for this, coming through the raw data.
You still can't. You still have to, you have to just trust and have faith as a scientist that the other scientist is telling you the truth. Yeah. Let it get out in the literature and then do some more studies. Then you can use AI to comb through. But there is an inherent element of trust and faith. And we never, writ large as culture and society, we never dared suspect for so long, at least in my lifetime, that trust was misplaced in our medical establishment. It sounds fringy and out there, but COVID was such an awakening for people of, wow, and maybe they were getting it wrong. And I don't mean this to be pejorative even to the clinicians, because I think it's fair to them mostly to say they're so busy doing what they're doing. They're trusting the guidance that's being given to them. Yeah. Now, they do have an obligation, though, to trust but verify. So that's why I say it's mostly fair.
Supposed to.
But it goes back to, well, they're trusting their organizations. We now know the organizations are ideologically captured and not advocating necessarily truth in medicine and science, but certainly ideological pushes, and which is why we're talking about it in the context and scope of the trans thing and the COVID thing, or just a few days ago, issues with Tylenol and other examples from the FDA that we were talking about when we first started here of people who browbeat their neighbors and family members and said, don't come to Thanksgiving. Don't come. We're writing you off because you're not believing the appeal to authority that we are demanding that you kneel to the authority of the CDC, the FDA, because they say so. Well, now the FDA has said something that they don't like, and they're like, don't trust them. They're ideologically captured. So they've instantly completely done a 180, changed not their position. They've changed their approach, because the approach is like, how do you justify your position? And in the past, it was the appeal to authority. But now that authority has undergone a change, it basically made the point that the authority is subject to ideology.
Wow. Who would have thought?
Yeah, exactly. And
I love watching this unfold in real time, because all my the peers that I went to school with, these EBM zealots, evidence-based medicine zealots, who like, oh, this is all peer-reviewed. Go ahead.
No, peer reviewing is broken, for one. It's an understatement. But that was my point, is that clinicians are trained to think that because it's gone through the rigors of peer review, that it's some sort. There is a lot of rigor sometimes in peer review. I've gone through a lot of it, and it's made my papers much better. A lot of credit to colleagues who do their duty. It's awesome. There's a complete, absolute dumpster fire of dog shit in peer review. And I've seen that too. There was an article written 6 or 8 months ago. I was offered a bribe by China as an editor in peer review.
Because China produces a lot of junk science.
It's not just China. We do too.
Oh, yeah.
Junk science is...
But
There's a big push. India's pretty bad. It's an equal opportunity dumpster fire of dog shit. Like, it does not, there's no stoppage of the dog shit at countries' boundaries. No. But peer review has a lot of problems to not just be trusted at face value, because think about it this way. It's essentially, you're reviewing a paper on a red-eye flight at midnight, hopefully on a cup of coffee, or if not, a glass of wine after a long day, because you're doing it for free. Right. I don't get paid as a reviewer. I don't get paid as a journal editor. And you're doing it for free. You're exhausted. You're spread thin. And like, it's just, when you have the chance to go through it with extraordinary detail, it's really a pretty special but rare chance. A lot of times people are ending up skimming or missing certain things, because at a certain level, it's not my job to do your homework either. Like, I'll assess it for what I can assess it for. But people forget, clinicians too, that when it's published, it's not the end of the story, it's the beginning. Once it's in the literature, you should not trust it because it's in the literature. You should use it as the literature's beginning point of testing it, not trusting it.
So you're saying that you should personalize medicine.
Yeah, and it's always
individualize
funny. It's really funny to hear like the evidence-based medicine thing. And I always tell people to think about, what does that mean? If they're advocating evidence-based medicine, if they're advocating we should change to evidence-based medicine, they're telling you that medicine's not evidence-based. And just by, what is that? That should be a huge wake-up call, that we're not basing medicine on evidence at all in some respects. A little bit that's tongue-in-cheek, of course. So, but yeah, I think when people went through these experiences through COVID and got to see that there is either ideological capture or sometimes just incorrect things. We get it wrong, or sometimes the getting it wrong has a motive. There can be that. It can also be innocent. But there's a lot of motivated interest, financial interest, money, power, ideology, and then just accidents. You should not just trust based upon that. And a lot of people grew up in a way, a lot of us included, that for which that was a shock to the system cognitively. And that's true for clinicians, right? Because people don't understand that clinicians get most of their information from the organizations, their professional organizations and associations, and that is get trust built based upon approvals of the FDA. People don't know that, like, how do you get FDA approval? Did it not kill 10 mice after 5 days, or whatever the element of their rule is, right? And that belies the whole conversation of like off-label use and everything else. But there really are reasons for caution that we didn't have on our awareness until just recently.
What I have been doing for the past couple of years, starting this practice, I started out super evidence-based, and so was my training, EBM. I did get a little red pilling in one of my classes. It was actually a really good course called EBM, Evidence-Based Medicine. Our job was to review some of these studies and like pick them apart. I don't think any of my classmates paid attention to that, or they didn't take that into practice, because afterwards it was just like follow the protocol, follow whatever up-to-date said on whatever algorithm you need to use. But what I did for the past 5 years is I made it a challenge to every week publish a lecture, an academic lecture, on my YouTube channel. So I have hundreds and hundreds of hours of academic lectures where I just went through PubMed, I read the research, and I tried to learn. And what I learned from that is you can find an argument that supports your opinion from any different paper. So what I started doing eventually is going back to the mechanism of action of the drug, the pathophysiology, learning how that works. Yes, looking at the study, seeing how it may have worked if it was a decent enough study, but then taking that with a grain of salt, using the mechanism of action, pathophysiology, and then applying it to the patient as a number needed to treat of 1. So each patient as an individual is going to have a unique response, and we follow that response. And of course, we look at some epidemiological data. It's called precision medicine. And I get my EBM colleagues who are like, you're doing anecdotes, you're not doing EBM. I'm doing precision medicine, and it's a real inception point for my colleagues. They can't understand that because they're using epidemiologic data and like big study trials, and they're following that. And they think they're on this great pedestal of purity. It's a weird way to think, I know, but that's how they think.
Yeah. So much of what has been moved forward as dogma in the medical industrial complex has been essentially based on frequentist statistics, which means the bell curve. And now it's funny you mentioned this because I've always talked about it in like the opposite way, which is as a scientist, I quip with my wife every now and then because I'm like, I speak in generalities, and there's memes about this on the internet where people will bring the exception to bear. And they'll be like, yes, but what about this? I'm like, yeah, I know there's exceptions. I'm talking about when I say a statement scientifically or medically, I'm like, I'm speaking about as a general rule, because what we found in findings are basically things that were true or statistically significant, like a t-test or an f-test, as a general rule under the bell curve, the majority, and like within 2 standard deviations of the mean. Of course, by de facto, that means that there are going to be exceptions to that rule. And so, of course, I know that I'm like, of course, I don't say that because I assume it's inherent that people understand that. So I'm like, so like when my wife points out an exception or somebody, the internet does this all the time. They're like, yes, but it drives me crazy and drives sometimes other people crazy where they're like, yeah, I know there's an exception, but I'm not talking about the tail ends of the distribution or individual variability. I'm talking about as a whole, generally speaking, this statement is true or seems to be true about this thing. And the inverse, the exact same point of the opposite side of that coin is what you're saying, which is that individual variability matters and that you can't just take something that was determined by a frequentist statistic of the mean of the bell curve and apply that to everyone and expect it to have equal effects on everyone. It may have some effects on everyone, but maybe different kinds of effects on everyone because individual variability matters. Now, psychology has come around to that, and there's a whole carve out that's emerged of studying individual variability, and that's probably one of the hot spots of the future, understanding decoding brain activity and things of that nature. But broadly speaking, you've had to move forward as a general rule with means and averages, but people don't understand that when we talk about things and clinical efficacy of any kind of medical treatment, we're basically just mushing it as an average and say the two averages of these 2 conditions are statistically significant, but that belies the whole distribution of the data and the individual variability thereof, which is exactly what you're essentially getting at and that other people are missing.
That's what we do every day in practice here in functional medicine and anti-aging medicine. It's super individualized. Each patient is never needed to treat of 1. Yes, we rely on the data. We go back to mechanism of action and we try to apply it. We see how it works on people, and we talk to people about the risk benefits of things, and it might work. And we're not the end all be all. We're not the pedestal of hierarchy dogma. No one is in medicine. Some like to think they are, and they think they know everything because they follow EBM or whatever that is to them. But it's a lot more wishy-washy, and it hurts. You go through all this education, you pay all this money for it, and you think you're doing the right thing by following evidence-based medicine. But from what I've been reading, I mean, from the studies I've looked at, there's no pedestal of purity that you can stand on and say something is ultimately right.
Yeah, I think what you described of your process is really important.
Unless they're transgender. There's some things that are ultimately right or wrong, but besides the point.
I think the process you described is really important for people to understand, which is that you said you go to PubMed and you would start looking at whatever the topic or the thing is that you want to understand. And then you said that it turns out that you can find generally completely different things
Yes.
being said by different articles, which, by the way, there's
Nothing wrong with it.
like the truth comes from that. And that is what I kind of wanted to mention, which is that what you were engaging in ultimately is what we call critical thinking. And it's a difficult skill because as humans, cognitively, we're easily duped all the time. That's just the nature of things. And so we need to practice our critical thinking skills to make sure that we don't get duped. And that's a tough thing to do, but we do it and we fail, and we'll always fail to a certain level. That's what we're always trying to like narrow down our bullseye to make sure that we get better and better at that calibration. We get trained in this oftentimes in higher education and whatnot. There's value in that. But what you were doing is a tough thing to do, and it's not done by most people. So I used to have assignments I would give students, and it would freak them out. They didn't understand it. Maybe I did a poor job explaining it, but I would say, okay, so your assignment, I don't know, read chapter 1 or chapter 2 in your standard textbook. And I said, and then I want you to go to and write a paper about any part of chapter 2 that's false. And these are like college students. All they're trained to do is know that what's in the book is right. It's just common knowledge. It's our framework.
That's a great exercise.
And I brought a teaching perspective from a more like a graduate student seminar where we're going to break down a journal article and find all the reasons it sucks, as opposed to, and once you're in the industry long enough, you realize the extent to which scientists wildly disagree about theories, facts, findings, other times very passionate way. But it's really common for scientists to scoff at the water cooler or at the conference about some dogma in the field. Because you deal with enough experiments and data in your everyday life, you're like, I don't know that this really shakes out the way that this textbook is playing. And that's the process in the industry of science and how we move forward. So I would have these assignments to students where I'd say, go find. I know for a fact that they're my friends. I know they wrote papers about this thing, proving this standard idea in the textbook wrong. I did. I wrote a paper in 2015 with data actually from a medial temporal lobectomy. Those are hippocampal amnesia hypoxia patients. But it proved wrong a dogma in the field that had been featured in a Nobel Prize winner's book. People do that all the time. That's our job. We're supposed to be advancing old knowledge by new ways of understanding. And for freshman, sophomore, junior, that's a world-shaking shakeup, right? Because that's not how you're taught to approach your textbook. So I'd say just write a one-page summary. Just find me anything that says something different about what you read. And people couldn't do the assignment. It was like a 404 error on a website. Their brain just couldn't compute because it's just not what they were fluent in as a mode of thinking, of critical thinking, of challenging and questioning the thing that we're told is dogma. But that's exactly what the field of science does every single day, or they ought to. The good scientists do. Not a lot of them are always the good scientists doing that. But that's what makes it fun. That's what makes it exciting and terrific, by the way. And that's what you were doing. It's like a time vampire.
Time vampire.
And that's why I was saying it was things like COVID are great wake-up opportunities for people to understand the limitations that clinicians often have, because their time is generally required to be focused on patients or epic or paperwork or all sorts of other things. Clinicians are extraordinary servants to culture because they put so much time into all the things that they do. It's just that the things that they generally do are not the things like perusing the literature of different competing theories and models and hypotheses to understand. And so there could be major differences.
It takes too much time.
Yeah. And I want to be really fair to clinicians too, in reminding people that what they do in essentially just, lack of a better term, just doing what the agencies tell them to do is reasonable. I also think that's reasonable. And I think that's fair because you can't live your whole life waiting to live life. You can't steal second base with your foot on first. As a clinician, you must move forward. You have to make a decision at some point. So we talked about surgery before. Okay, so let's say you're doing surgery on something. You can't, at some point you have to decide to make the cut. You're never going to know, is it too much tissue that's going to go beyond the cancer, or is it not enough tissue that's going to leave some cancer in? At some point, as a clinician, as a human being in life, you have to decide. And that decision is always a gamble, and it's always a guess. You can be 99.999% sure, but at the end of the day, you must move forward as a pragmatic point as a clinician. And clinicians know this, right? I'm trying to champion them now too. But like when you're practicing medicine, you're practicing, you're failing. Guess what? You're the experiment. You never do it. You practice it because it's always a certain amount of a guess. And it's very reasonable because if your doctor is waiting to get it perfectly right before making the diagnosis and the prescription and the treatment in the patient before you down the hall, they will never come to your room. You do have to make a guess. And I tell people, it's like you're never really sure about who you're marrying, right? You hope you don't get divorced. You really hope. But you have to open up your heart to love. You have to take that leap. And divorce lawyers wouldn't exist if you were making a decision of certainty. You're not. And so people need to understand that's a reasonable way that doctors have to move forward, or they will spend their entire career looking at one patient in one room just to get it right. Yeah. Just to be sure. What if we just do one more? So that's obviously an absurd in that situation as a teaching point that like they have to make guesses. We call it heuristics in psychology. It's how human beings have to approach the world using really good guesses or using heuristics about guesses of what we know generally to be true. And heuristics are developed over experience, trial, error, failure, success. And that's how we build our mental model, our mental worldviews. And we can use heuristics to get by on the world more than just intuition, but that's especially true as a doctor, as a clinician. You will push more people through your doors, which means more people get treated, healed. The more experienced you are as a doctor, you move quicker because you're like, I'm pretty sure this is what you have. If I'm wrong, come back and I'll switch it. No. And that's how you get past sitting in a waiting room. You need the doctor to see more patients and take you in from the waiting room, which means they need to go faster, which means they can't be sure about everything. They have to make some reasonable guesses. And part of those guesses and those reasonable professional medical decisions have to come from things that they're not sure about, that they don't know 100% about, that have to come from their professional associations, the AMA, the whoever, the FDA, the CD, like somebody. You have to trust somebody on some things that you're not certain about. And we're never certain about anything. That's kind of like a philosophical head trip. But I say that on good balance so that our society is not ripped apart by these like black, white, binary decisions of like, there is nuance and texture, and it really, sometimes it's tough.
It's tough for the way the current model is. The reason we're a little bit different is we have a direct primary care model. So it allows us to not have to bill insurance. So we don't need to see 30 patients a day, which is actually pretty typical for a PA in primary care. I was actually told that once when I was interviewing for a job. They wanted me to see minimum 24, but 30 would be really good, and I could get a bonus for seeing 30 a day. Us here, we see maybe 6, 8 a day at most, and it takes a lot more time. We have 40-minute follow-ups, 80-minute, 70-minute appointments for a new patient. But it allows us to think a little bit more. And if we don't have to sit around billing insurance all day, that saves a lot of time. So it gives us a lot more. Obviously, we can't see the volume that a regular primary care taking insurance would do. We don't have to because the patients are paying us every month. And they're paying us every month to give us that ability to think about their case a little bit more, study it a little bit more, and not have to be the hamster in the wheel.
That's huge, by the way. I don't think people often understand the impact of what it means when you said that it gives us the time to think about them a little bit more. We just talked a lot about how much time it takes to research the literature and this and that. The last paper I had come out was 11 months ago, and it was the discovery of a new kind of human memory. It took probably a year or two to just do the writing of that paper, and the experiment was started almost 8 years prior to that. So almost 8 years, start to complete finish. Is a major discovery, but it took a long time. The biggest parts of that discovery, I don't want to say it came on accident, but they came from a really slow cook simmer of thinking about it over time. Because it took that long, and there were times it was on the back burner and I had to put it on pause, it allowed that sort of richness of the steak to cook. And I'd get these ideas of an analysis to do or a logical approach to something like in the shower or walking the dog. But like when you as a clinician talk about your model with your patients, allowing you to have less time arguing with insurance or begging insurance or doing whatever the administrative bureaucratic paperwork is, and that you repurpose that time to just think about the patient. Maybe when you're walking your dog or take a shower, but to have that time in the sauna or in the gym, you're still thinking about them. But when it's just a physical, raw resource of time, mental time, that's when real ideas happen. That's when real breakthroughs happen, real discoveries happen. And I have to imagine it's true for you guys as clinicians. That's when you come up, maybe we should do this, or maybe this is what's actually, and so most doctors are just not afforded that luxury. And some doctors do an amazing job as warriors against the insurance companies to get you your insurance coverage, to get them to cover this code or this bill. And they really go to bat for you. But that means they spend a huge chunk of their time on the phone, on waiting, talking to another administrator. And all of that is time away from thinking about the two things that matter. What's wrong with you? How do we fix it?
Yep. You figured it out. You summarized what we do very well here. So I think that's good enough for today. That's 2 hours and 6 minutes. Longest podcast I've done. Not as long as your O'Keefe one. 3 hours.
Yeah.
I got to 2 hours and 30 minutes with that one.
Sorry, I don't.
Yeah, you're great talk. You have a lot, yeah, and of course you have a high IQ. You got a lot of thoughts up there.
When we like cross-pollinate so many topics, you can tell the stuff I really actually enjoy talking about is my profession, right? Our job, science, medicine, human behavior. It's just right now, like so many of these conversations end up talking about the politics of DEI, speaking truth. And that's the stuff that's on the but cross-pollinating. It's different topics are essentially different shows, and we just mush them into one.
It's all one working against or with another.
Feel free to chop off like whatever you need from this and just make it an hour, 10 minutes.
Full uncensored version goes up on YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts.
We're here. We're good.
We'll end it there.
Enjoy the conversation.